All right, welcome everyone to another week of our Proseminar speaker series. If you are attending virtually, please mute yourself. I'll just say that up front. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box, although I will tell you I cannot see them because I am also the speaker today. And so the way I'm sharing my screen, I can't see you all and I cannot see the chat thread. So if you're putting questions in the chat thread, I'll check them at the end of the talk, but I won't see them as I'm talking. And that may just be because I am not tech savvy, and so maybe there's a better way to do this, but I didn't figure it out. So just know I cannot see any of you. So that being said, I have been acting as host for ProSem this semester, and today I'm actually also the speaker, and so it did not occur to me to arrange for anyone to give me a formal introduction, so I will just introduce myself. So I am Lisa Johnson. I am a faculty member here in the Department of Anthropology, and since about 2008, I've been working in Belize for over a decade, mostly excavating and researching Maya household rituals, including burials and caches. But since 2016, I have since been working in Mexico. And my interests are much broader, of course. We're looking at a citywide scale now, and we're looking at a wide diversity of practices, not just ritual and caching, burials and caches. But I'm going to draw on my work in both of those places, in Belize and in Mexico, for my talk today, which is titled Keeping Up with the Joneses, Neighbors and Neighborhoods in the Lowland Maya Cities. So in this talk, I consider how archaeologists in the Maya region, working in these classic period cities, how they define neighborhoods, how they explore their characteristics, and why neighborhoods are important for those that lived in Maya cities. But I consider the diversity of Maya neighborhoods as they have been identified, but also some of the challenges to defining distinct communities archaeologically. Before turning to my own study in a neighborhood study at Palenque in Chiapas, Mexico, and its preliminary results. So in the last decade, interest in neighborhoods has really become fairly popular because most agree that where you have large cities or large settlements, there will be smaller communities within those cities. And these groupings allow individuals to foster more personal relationships and more direct kind of interaction in a city that's generally too big to know everyone. So when we consider what makes a neighbor, archaeologically, we look at a few factors. We consider spatial proximity, their closeness, their relative closeness to each other, but also other factors including more social factors such as shared practices, and that's reflective in artifact types and distributions and their patterns. And while the spatial proximity might be a bit more intuitive in some cases, the social factors can be much more elusive and much more challenging when you go looking for material correlates. One archaeologist, Stephen Warnke, suggested that these habits of affiliation, the constant interaction, would produce similarities in practices materially that we could actually identify. But as I'll talk about, that's not always the case. But at the neighborhood level, what would make a neighborhood? Most discussions of Maya neighborhoods inevitably mention one primary factor, that is the ability of face-to-face interactions. The general consensus seems to be that any community larger than about 500 is too big to be a neighborhood, as it's not possible to know every single individual, although maybe lower at about 200 is much more practical as a general calculation for a typical neighborhood size. So it gives us some parameters, right, to look for. The other factor is the spatial characteristics, how they're actually organized. In some cases, it's easy to tell. You have these very clearly kind of bounded and clustered settlements within the city. Either they share topography or they're physically bounded by walls or other features like rivers or causeways. So I'm going to look at some of those across these various cities that I have shown here on a map. These are sites that have had extensive studies done, and the archaeologists working there have talked extensively about the neighborhoods in these cities. So it gives me something to look for or compare in my own work at Palenque. So that when I turn to Palenque, you'll see some of the some hypotheses we can form and look for, but we're beginning to see just how diverse they really are. So there are various features or qualities that we can look for in order to define a neighborhood, but they're not always the same in every Maya city. And in fact, many of the cities I'll bring up today kind of represent that diversity. There are cases such as this one at a site called Rio Bec, where you have these clustered residential groups that have been defined as neighborhoods, and they're bounded by these drainage channels. So the very landscape kind of creates these kind of spatial divisions. But internally, these hypothesized neighborhoods are diverse. They actually, it's argued, they represent the diversity of the whole of the city, where you have a mix of kind of elite residences and smaller size residents, all within one single neighborhood. So while the spatial division and organization is clear, the social characteristics are not unique from one neighborhood to another. In other cases, some archaeologists have looked for what we call focal nodes. This is a centralized area for congregating that would draw, a neighborhood would grow around. So whether it's a shared watering hole, a neighborhood market, a neighborhood temple, or in some cases, as we'll look at, a high-ranking residence, an individual residence where a neighborhood kind of grows around a leading residential group, may serve as a focal node. But here at Rio Bec, there's no focal nodes. They just have these kind of spatial clusterings. In other cities like Copan in Honduras, neighborhoods take on a different kind of organization, where Julia Hendon, working there, she identified two neighborhoods, one to the north called Las Sepulturas, that clusters along a paved causeway. And this neighborhood has an overall pattern where most of the residential groups are organized around an internal patio. But to the south, the other neighborhood, El Bosque, she argues, is very different. It's organized differently. The residential structures are situated in different directions. They're much more variable in terms of their size and orientation. And she found that the neighborhood to the south is actually later in time. And so some of the diversity in the kind of shape that neighborhoods take may be reflective of a history of city growth. So now we have to consider that as well. So at Rio Bec and at Copan, we see that there is diversity across the residential structures, the kinds of shapes that the residential structure takes in their orientation. And they did not always conform to the same design or pattern, but there are some cases where the residential group was fairly uniform across the entire city. There's a standardized layout to a residential group. And a really good example of that is Caracol in Belize. So this is a case where, regardless of size, wealth, or rank, all residential groups basically conform to what we call this plazuela, or this patio design, where you have multiple structures situated around a central interior patio. So entire city is organized around that. But in terms of social characteristics, as reflected in material practices at Caracol, it's easier to identify city-wide practices suggestive of an urban identity than it is to identify distinct neighborhood social characteristics. So one of those city-wide practices that has been described as a quote-unquote Caracol identity is the practice of building these Eastern mausoleums in their households. where overwhelmingly, estimated now 70% of the population of Karakol built their household mausoleum on the eastern side of their patio. So this is where multiple burials are interred. And this is a pretty good guesstimate considering the investigators there have been working multiple decades and I think at this point excavated over 100 residential groups. So this pattern bears out and it's a wide pattern across the city. In addition to the construction of the eastern shrines in the majority of Karakol's residences, what you see inside those mausoleum structures is fairly standardized too. The repeated offerings of these modeled face cache vessels, so they're actually called face caches. What you're looking at is an archaeological drawing of a section, so a cross section into one of these mausoleum structures with multiple burials. So associated with these tombs, you have multiple floor levels and they're inserting these face cache offerings in addition to these small kind of lip to lip bowls, these little bowls set lip to lip at the front of the mausoleum. So these face cache vessels almost always contain a bundle of objects. If you have your mic on, can you mute yourself, please? Okay. So these face cache vessels almost always have objects inside them, offerings of objects like these shaped obsidian objects called quote unquote eccentrics. And so even the modeled faces are fairly standardized. In addition to these quote unquote finger bowls, so these are small little bowls set lip to lip with the human phalanges in them, sometimes with an obsidian blade, like the one here. Presumably the very blade that may have cut off the finger. So this is also very common and is found throughout the city. So in mapping where these face caches and these bowls are found, they're found across the city. So they're argued to be a Karakol identity. However, when you try to make the distinction at the neighborhood level, it becomes much more challenging, especially at Karakol. So the neighborhoods at Karakol have been hypothesized to be based primarily on spatial proximity, so where they cluster on shared hilltops and occupied contemporaneously would be considered neighbors and possibly forming a neighborhood. So I'm showing you one they have circled, they've identified as Machete neighborhood. Like Copan, you see causeways actually provide an entrance to individual neighborhoods, but also like Copan, it means the boundaries are fuzzy. While you may have a clear entrance into the neighborhood, it's not so clear as to where the boundaries of one neighborhood ends and the boundaries of another begin. So that becomes problematic. Also, there are no clear focal nodes at Karakol where you have one central focal node, like one monumental residential group or one watering hole or one marketplace that a neighborhood could be organized around. So Karakol also represents a case where distinct neighborhoods are difficult to define by their social characteristics as well, because they all adhere to the same layout in their residences. They all adhere to that same kind of Eastern mausoleum practice. They're all using the same kinds of offerings, although on a much more subtle differences they've found from one household to the next are differences in things like diet and the history of development across those households. So that may be something to look for too. So Karakol and Rio Bec neighborhoods do not appear to be organized around single features on the landscape. They are clustered collectives reflective of the diversity of the whole, each with varying degrees of wealth and size and elaboration. But in other cases, you have cities where there are clear focal nodes, or argued to be clear focal nodes around which these neighborhoods are organized. And one good example here is in the northern lowlands, Chuchuquil. They've done an extensive study here where what you're seeing is a map of these large monumental residential groups that have been argued to serve as these focal nodes. And these dendritic walkable paths that the surrounding residential groups could access these focal nodes. So fairly widely dispersed, evenly dispersed across the city are these focal nodes, and they appear as these large monumental residential groups, and around which the neighborhood is organized. And in this case, individual residential groups are also easy to identify because they surrounded them with little low-lying stone walls. So we have perimeters around individual residential groups, some of which have little alleyways in between them. So you can even see where their walkable paths are between one neighbor and the next. And this is actually a pattern we've seen in other northern lowland cities as well. These little low-lying walls to demarcate one residential group from another. And I mention that because not all cities have such clear boundaries. And in other cities, such as the one I work at, identifying even individual residential groups can be challenging, where you just have this kind of seemingly random orientation of buildings all clustered in the city. So we don't have fences or anything that demarcate. So taking what we know about these other cities and the kind of diverse forms neighborhoods can take, knowing the diversity of urban forms and the internal organization across the Maya lowlands, we use those known patterns to then consider what we are finding in Palenque. So preliminary results suggest that Palenque 2 is distinct, and it will only add to the known diversity and dynamics of Maya cities during the classic period of roughly 250 to 900 CE. So looking at the spatial proxemics of Palenque, we see that there are sub-clusterings of residential groups within the city due to the topography. So Palenque is a unique city compared to some of these other cities because it's essentially built on the side of the sloping sierras. And in order to do that, they carved out a series of terraces. And so what we have are residential sectors that we've circled in red here, our proposed quote unquote neighborhoods, cluster on shared terraces. So to the south is the extreme mountainous terrain, and then it empties out into these alluvial plains to the north. And so we have multiple permanent rivers running through the city. So we have both topography that clusters some of these residential sectors, but also water separates one cluster from another. So we have multiple rivers running through that kind of bound some of these little, if they are indeed neighborhoods as well. So we have topography and we have waterways to separate one cluster from the next. Since 2016, we've been working in this part of the city. So here's the main palace and the main kind of core of the city. We are just hundreds of meters away. And we began working in group 4, which is a very elaborate, well-known elite residence, clearly associated with the ruling elite of Palenque. But we've now expanded our work to include other parts of our proposed neighborhood. And this is where we're going to continue going forward, is to really explore the diversity of this one cluster. So we looked at Caracol, and the Chases working there have described these widespread practices of Eastern-oriented mausoleum and caching practices as reflective of a Caracol identity. We have things at Palenque too that are so widespread and ubiquitous across the city that we can consider them part of a Palenque identity. One of which is overwhelmingly the practice of burying your dead extended with the head oriented to the north. That is an overwhelming pattern across the city, regardless of wealth or status. But also these figurines are found everywhere, both in domestic context, in individual households, but in palaces and temples and all the monumental architecture as well. So figurines are ubiquitous. Let's see how my time is. Okay. There are select residential groups in the city of Palenque that stand out as unique. They're very elaborate stone-built residential compounds. And in these groups, there have been these incense burners found. So there are some objects that maybe not everyone had access to, only select status individuals had access to. The use of these ceramic composite incensarios are much more restricted. So they look like this. And you'll see where these residential groups are. They're within each one of our proposed neighborhoods. We also looked to other things that we've seen in other Maya cities as reflective of a social identity, and that is in the ways that individuals modified their bodies or decorated their bodies. And of course, archaeologically, we can look to things like cranial modification and teeth modification as a way of modifying the body that leaves evidence. But what we find here is also interesting. There are patterns, but not patterns suggestive of a city-wide identity, but patterns suggestive of a much more personal kind of choice. Only a small percentage of individuals chose to have their cranium modified, and there's no overwhelming pattern that suggests it's an elite choice or it's reflective of wealth or rank. So there's no overwhelming pattern that suggests it's a gendered kind of choice either. There are patterns in the form that they chose where overwhelmingly for those few that did choose to modify their crania, they go for the tabular oblique form, which is this sloping form, which is different compared to the northern lowlands where they found for the few that chose to modify their crania, they preferred the tabular erect, where you have a much wider, flatter forehead. But even across Palenque, of the percentage that did choose to modify their crania, over 90% did choose the tabular oblique form. We can look at the way they were modifying their teeth and filing their teeth, the kind of patterns they chose there too, and it's quite diverse. And again, it doesn't reflect an overwhelming pattern restricted to wealth or status or anything like that. So there's quite a diversity there in the kinds of styles that they choose. Although overwhelmingly you see for those that did modify their teeth, they preferred the inlay pattern where you have either a single shell or jade, stone, and painted in the tooth. So at Palenque, it has been previously suggested that these select residential groups may have served as leading houses for their respective neighborhoods. They are relatively located at the center of their respective neighborhoods. They tend to be the largest, most elaborate residential groups for their neighborhood. They are also spaces that have ritual practices, evidence, burials are there in the floors and the rooms of these buildings. Which may be the case. However, we still need to raise the question, is this really the case, or does it just happen to be that these are the only residential groups that have actually been excavated and consolidated? So yes, they're very large and elaborate. Their location within their respective neighborhoods may be a key, but we know very little about the residential groups that surround them. So we don't have anything to really compare them to either. And if we follow this model that suggests that these are leading houses for their respective neighborhoods, we may also see that they're more alike with each other than they are with the residential groups that are immediately next to them. So these groups here, Murciélagos Group B, Group C, Group 4, where we worked, they have all been excavated and consolidated, and they're clearly the most monumental ones in their respective regions. So it may be the case where they serve as the focal node for their respective neighborhoods. If we look a bit closer at what those neighborhoods look like, unlike Chunchukmil in the northern lowlands, where you have individual low limestone walls bounding each individual residential group, we don't have that. Unlike Karakol, we don't have a standardized residential design, so we can't go by that either. So instead, we have a diversity of sizes, orientation, and forms, and not all of them create these really nice bounded clusters or patio groups. So we don't know, are we looking at individual residences reflective of a diversity of wealth, reflective of a diversity of activities and occupations, reflective of a history of growth where the oldest are the largest and most elaborate, and the youngest in time are smaller and haven't grown yet? Because none of those structures have been excavated, so we don't know what the relationship is and what the reason for that kind of diversity. So this is another one of those proposed hypotheses or proposed neighborhoods where you have B group is in the very center. It's the most elaborate series of rooms, and then you have these kind of clusters of structures all on these terraces around it, but it becomes challenging to separate one from the next, which belongs to individual residential groups. Since 2016, our team began working in group 4 here in the center. This is a large, elaborate residential group located relatively in the center of our proposed neighborhood. So you can see as group 4 where it's mapped does appear to be one of the most elaborately constructed. It adheres to that very formal kind of internal patio design compared to all of the neighboring residential structures that are all kind of oriented in different directions and different sizes and different forms. So we're now excavating to answer some of these questions. Does this diversity indicate a history of growth, or does the diversity represent a variation in wealth and occupation, residential or non-residential areas? The neighborhood that we've defined has an estimated 109 structures. If we use some of the same models that have been used in other cities, estimating that about 5 people per structure, then that means about 545 Maya lived in this neighborhood, if we use a similar kind of model. Compared to other neighborhoods in other lowland cities, it falls in the middle in terms of size. So our study begins with the proposition that group 4 could have been a focal node around which this neighborhood is organized. There are a few things that make this particular residential group unique. And if Palenque's residents and neighborhoods did organize themselves around a leading house, this would certainly be that leading house from what we know about it. It has space to accommodate the entire neighborhood. If we use that 545 figure and we look at the plaza space, so using a similar kind of approach that others have used in other Maya cities, we could say if each person is given about a square meter in the plaza, they could host events that could accommodate the entire neighborhood. So that's one feature of a focal node. It's a place for congregating. There are other reasons why group 4 stands apart and also could draw a crowd. They not only have the space, but they also house the remain of individuals that were clearly very important in these formal mausoleum structures in group 4. And while they may have been housed in group 4, it appears that a wider community was drawn to this residential group because to date, we have over 100 men, women, and children all buried in the patio and in the inset corners of these mausoleum structures, spanning over 300 years. So people continue to flock to this particular residential group to be buried, spatially associated with these mausoleum structures in and around them on the patio, in the patio area. But even within the same neighborhood, within the same residential group, there's considerable diversity where some individuals were clearly given very distinct burial treatment, much more elaborate treatment. So we have obviously a diversity of wealth and influence even within the same residential group. For example, deep within the Eastern Mausoleum, one of the first buildings I excavated, we found that inside was an earlier ceremonial feature, this altar, this square altar, and the altar was set directly above this cruciform crypt of a middle-aged male And it was one of the first burials, the earliest dates we got for this residential group. So he is argued to be a kind of founding ancestor for this group around the Middle Classic period, around 500. So for the next 300 years, the house would grow around him, but he may have been the first to kind of anchor this area. He's given a burial, this cruciform crypt shape. We see this elsewhere in the city, not in this group, but he's given a burial similar to those that we've seen in the Temple of the Count nearby and in Temple 18A, which is argued to be royal burials. So his burial is much more closer and patterned to the royal elite than it is to his neighbors. And that altar that was built directly above his burial is a site of extensive ritual activity. So we have all of this residue and debris. So clearly they were returning to the space. There's extensive burning, whole incense burners with the copal resin and the pine still in it, whole fish, freshwater snail and food, thousands of sherds from really fancy kind of servingware, all left, smashed and broken around this altar. There's only one other context in the city of Palenque that looks anything like this, and it was in Temple 19. There's a bench there that had this massive collection of burning and smashing left associated with that bench. So another argument as to what constitute a focal node is the hosting of these kind of communal events for their neighborhood. In the mausoleum structure right next to that one, in the late classic period around 700, they built another mausoleum structure for another middle-aged male individual. And once again, his burial is much more closely aligned in terms of its treatment to the royal elite, not his neighbors and not the other individuals buried in the plaza. So he's given a special kind of burial. The kinds of things he's buried with are unique. His entire body was covered in red cinnabar. The only other case where we have that is the so-called Red Queen, Pakal's bride, the use of the cinnabar, so not everybody gets that kind of treatment either. He has modified teeth, but again, I said that's not really reflective of wealth or status in and of itself, but he was given the kind of jewelry and adornments that only the royal elite had access to. He has similar kind of jade jewelry and ornaments to those that we've seen in Pakal. Pakal had this kind of quadripartite design ear flares, and then the unknown royal individual in Temple 18A had a similar kind of elaborate jade ear flares. So he has jewelry and ornaments that others do not have in his house. He chose to have his teeth modified in a design that even Chan Balam, who is also in the epigraphy identified royal ruler of Palenque, this pattern, this E pattern, where the incisors are shaped, or the front teeth are shaped. In the pottery that are in his mausoleum is identical to the pottery found in Temple of the Cross. So he's enjoyed some of the same pottery that's found in these kind of monumental temple structures. So essentially what I'm saying here is that even amongst the quote unquote leading houses, there is diversity. Those other groups, Murciélagos B group, C group, while they are elaborate compounds and they're clearly wealthy and influential, they did not have some of the items that even group 4 had. So group 4 wasn't using those ceramic composite incensarios, they were using stone incensarios that are nearly identical to the ones found in the palace and in the monumental architecture. So they appear to be much more closely aligned with the royal elite, not even their elite neighbors or neighboring neighborhoods. In addition to, and I didn't mention, group 4 is the only known residential group that had its own epigraphy and big stone tablet and throne room, which is not really common. So the residential group 4 clearly housed influential members of Palenque society, and that's here. In other Maya neighborhood studies, there has been a suggestion that spatial proximity and continuous face-to-face interaction would lead to shared material practices. But others have questioned whether that would always be the case. So just this past summer, we continued our neighborhood study. So we selected a stratified random sample so that we could have the diversity of structure size and shape and form and orientation kind of represented. We began that study this past summer, and we were working in this area here, which is the very western edge of our proposed neighborhood. And in fact, you see it's right next to the Motiapa River. And unfortunately, what I found after excavating this summer is the whole front side of the building had essentially collapsed down this very steep riverbank. So they really were bounded by the river over here. So we were in this compound, which was mapped back in 2000 and labeled J033, and in the neighboring structures J036 and J037. You can see there are multiple waterways kind of running in and around these residential groups and terracing. So you're actually descending down the terraces. Here's a map of our excavation. We luckily had some midden areas. So anybody doing household archaeology can appreciate the garbage. We look for the garbage. We found all the garbage, which is really great. So what you're looking at, we don't have a nice four-sided patio group. What we have is two structures situated, one running east-west and one running north, and a little tiny alleyway separated them. One structure to the north clearly had a stone roof, so it was complete stone architecture. But the structure to the south was just a long stone patio or platform that most likely was support for a perishable structure on top. So the front side of the structure all eroded down the riverbank. So we had the back sides of the structure, and this is where the Maya tend to throw their garbage away. So that really worked out. I did a large kind of clearing excavation over the architecture, not wanting to dismantle too much of the architecture. I am in a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so I have to justify putting big holes in places. But I did trench through this platform so that I can retrieve carbon dates and more of a kind of diachronic view. What I found, though, is really interesting in terms of household archaeology. I have a diverse suite of tools suggestive of multi-crafting. So this residential group, we have a large number of worn axes, limestone axes, the kinds of things you would use to clear the terraces, to chop wood, that kind of thing. So there's a large number of those. So they're working the land. I have chisels and axes that may be suggestive of woodworking or something like that. Drills, drilling holes, perforating things. I have a large number of blades, and in fact, in terms of quantity, with over 500 blades and blade fragments is pretty impressive compared to other residential groups. So they had access to plenty of obsidian. And then I had the standard kind of domestic stuff I was hoping for, the manos and the metates that reflect kind of foodways and food processing. You'll notice these are dirty. I left them dirty so they can be sampled for phytoliths and starches and stuff. What was also really helpful is found smashed on the plaster floor was an entire vessel that is this Otulum era vessel that puts it at about 700 to 800 CE. Smashed on the floor. So what this suggests is group 4 that we just saw, that large elaborate compound that may serve as a focal node that has an over 300-year history. This residential group is occupied later, on the later end. So it's on the very edge of the neighborhood. It's late in terms of the city's growth. And in fact, after 800, the city of Palenque itself is mostly abandoned. So it's one of those latest residential groups that we can tell so far without doing carbon dating. But in some cases, the things that we found in J033 are just more reflective of the same pattern city-wide patterns that we see in other areas of the city. So we're replicating that quote-unquote urban identity. A large number of figurines, and many of the figurines are nearly identical to the kinds of figurines that you find in the other residential groups. So clearly there is production of these figurines happening in the city, and they had access to that as well. But there are subtle differences. So we're also looking for the subtle differences. Just as they saw at Caracol, where some of the subtle differences are in foodways from one residential group to the next, there are differences compared to group 4 and these groups in terms of the kinds of stuff they're eating. So in group 4, where we also excavated a midden context, that was very good. Overwhelmingly, they were eating fish. Like over 70% of the faunal was all fish from the local rivers. But in JO33, the pattern is actually reversed. Overwhelmingly, it's mammals and reptiles with only 10% fish. So here you have two groups in the same neighborhood, slightly different kind of cuisine or diet preferences. And then there was a surprising find in JO33. Now, clearly JO33 is not the commoners we're looking for. They were wealthy, they had access to some fancy stuff that has yet to be found anywhere else in the Maya lowlands. These white stone artifacts that are close to alabaster, they've only been found as vessels. A few alabaster vessels have been reported in the Maya lowlands, and all in royal tombs. I have a residential group here with broken portable artifacts made of this stuff. And the one publication I found of anybody analyzing these white stone things said, to date, there has been no portable artifacts, but only in the form of vessels. So this is something I have to contend with. I have stuff that nobody's ever found. So I have to think about that. But also, they had marble tiles broken, some of which have these residues of adhesives and stuff on them. So they may have served as mirror backs or something like that. These are imported too. These are not local. They may be coming from the Copan area, from Honduras. So here's a residential group that has access to some exotic stuff, and it's seemingly broken and thrown away. So they're clearly not hard up for goods. So work up to this point suggests that there is diversity even among the so-called leading houses of Palenque. If we look at group 4 compared to even Murciélagos, group B, group C, those other major compounds, where group 4 stands apart. The leaders of this house may have been even closer to Palenque royalty than they are to their neighbors. So this is a hierarchical landscape as well. But there's still much to learn as to the degree that hierarchy was felt in the homes of other Palencanos. We will continue to investigate surrounding household groups, residential groups, to consider those social characteristics. I'm focusing this summer on some of the smallest structures we found in the area. And we're going to look to continue to ask those questions. Does this diversity, does it reflect a diversity of wealth and access, a diversity of activities and material practices, or a diversity in terms of the history of the city just filling in over time, where you have the most elaborate ones are the oldest houses, and then the city grew up around them? That's another question. So those are some of the questions we're considering as well. There's so much more data that hasn't been processed. Trying to do a good job with this household archaeology. We did do soil chemistry across the plaster floors. We're looking at really fine-grained residues for unique activity areas. All of that will come in later, but this is just what we know now from the quick inventory and catalog of the stuff I've done this past summer. So already some things are coming to bear in terms of the diversity of a quote-unquote neighborhood in Palenque, which is quite interesting. So that's what I did this summer. So I'm going to stop sharing because I have not seen anybody, and if anybody has any comments or questions, I can't see it. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll see if I can see you all. Okay, let's see. Pull up the chat. Here we go. Okay, all right. Hi, Dr. Johnson, thank you for the presentation. Was there any kinds of pattern of distance between city neighborhoods? Were they within a mile of each other or more spread out depending on the nature or man-made barriers? This is a good question. Here is another thing where we can talk about diversity from one city to the next. So a lot of the cities had to contend with their own local landscape. So Palenque is building on the side of a mountain. Caracal is a very hilly kind of mountainous landscape, and they were surrounded by all these agricultural terraces. So they tended to cluster in and around these agricultural terracing. Rio Bec clustered in and around these kind of swampy Bajo areas and channels because they were dealing with this kind of swampy terrain. So in terms of how far apart people are spread out, those studies have been done to talk about like density, the number of structures within a small area. And in that case, I think Palenque ranks amongst the top like 5 in terms of density, because even though it's only 2.2 square kilometers makes up the core of the city, there's over 1,800 structures. So they were essentially on top of each other on the side of a mountain. So you could spit at your neighbor in Palenque. This is not the case in every Maya city. So it's difficult to come up with one overarching like definition of what constitutes a neighbor in terms of space. So that does not answer your question. So that's a no. But yes, thank you for bringing that up. The next thing we're also doing, because we want to do similar to what they tried to do at Chuchukmil, where they were actually looking at movement in and around space, like because they have these alleyways, you can actually do these walkways and try to map where people can move. Now that we have the LiDAR data, we're going to look at where these residential groups are next to each other, where you would have most likely moved in and between them, and the ease of that quote unquote face-to-face interaction. I was waiting for somebody to ask about the finger bowls. Yeah. Okay, so the finger bowls, whether there's actually cut marks. I do not know of cases where there are actual cut marks on the bones themselves, although I did not analyze the bones, and I know that they still need a much closer look at the bones. So yeah, I can't answer that question for you, Jenny. It's a good question considering you have detached fingers associated with an obsidian blade. You infer one is related to the other, but actual cuts on the fingers, I don't know if they've seen those. Jameen, you have your hand up. Do you want to put your speaker on?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. You study neighborhood, it's fascinating. And I just wonder, how does your findings and talking about diversity of the neighborhood help us to think about the neighborhood around us?
Well, I mean, one of the things I wrote about recently, and I think I was trying to kind of touch on that here and there in this presentation, is spatial proxemics alone we occupy multiple social circles, right? So we may have more in common with those of a similar class, ethnicity than we do with our neighbors right next to us. And so when you're looking for that archaeologically, when we talk about shared identities and shared material practices, I see elements of that at Palenque where clearly there are multiple factors that contribute to unique identities. You have your citywide imagined community, so to speak. You have your social circles you occupy where there are similar individuals of similar rank and class and status, and individuals in group 4 are identified by name in the palace as having attended events in the palace. So we know that those that lived in group 4 had a direct relationship with the ruler and in fact served him in some way. So they're clearly occupying a very different social circle than, say, other individuals that may be their direct neighbors. So with that in mind, I'm going to continue to look at the smaller structures immediately surrounding them to see what do they look like compared to these large quote unquote neighborhood centers if they were in fact one. Oh, and I forgot to mention, Group 4 has this cemetery with over 100 individuals buried in it. There are no burials in JO33. So I'm keeping this in mind because the argument is Group 4, if it is a focal node, and if this is the kind of anchor around which the neighborhood is organized, it's quite possible that the neighborhood is burying their dead associated with this central. They're not burying it in their residences. I don't have any burials at JO33. So if I continue to excavate this summer in the surrounding residential groups and still find no burials, and we're still finding bodies in Group 4. They're not done excavating Group 4, and I think the number's up to 120 something. So they're still finding burials. I'm not finding any. So they may have been a focal node for that purpose too. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. What was your favorite part of this experience? Susan, what experience? This past summer or all of it? Just this past summer. Well, it wasn't getting COVID and it wasn't being flooded out every other day because we're now excavating during the rainy season. That was not fun. I think the thing that I'm most excited about right now is the diversity of stuff we're finding that is unique. Group 4, the kinds of crafting that's happening there is mainly related to weaving and sewing. I don't have that in JO33. So I'm looking at the different activities these groups are doing too. And they're not weaving and sewing in JO33, but they have a lot of stone, little diversity toolkit of stone tools. So they must be multi-crafting other things. So I'm excited to see the diversity of stuff. Because this, I think the exciting thing here is this kind of work hasn't really been done at Palenque. It's both a blessing and a curse that Palenque is so, you know, it has this architecture, it has the art, and it's famous for all of those things, but we know nothing about its common population. We only know about the kings and the queens. So I'm excited to keep pursuing those questions. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yes, of course, Laura, sorry.
Yeah, back to the finger. I have more questions. I'm not sure, I might have heard you wrong, but like the full fingers were associated with like burials.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if those fingers came from other people or the person who was buried.
Not the person who's buried.
Okay.
So one of the suggestions has been made, and they really need to talk about this more explicitly, or at least explore this question more explicitly. But I made this suggestion in an earlier publication. There are ethnographic examples that this is a form of mourning. I think in New Guinea, widows would cut their own fingers or deform themselves in some way as a form of mourning. So I argued that this is reflective of mourning practices. They tend to be, these finger bowls tend to be clustered out in front of the mausoleum structure. So they're most likely for the individuals buried within the tombs inside the structures. And then you have a cluster of these little finger bowls outside and on the stairs. Yeah, Jenny.
So these would be probably like family members, things like that. So now you need to ask, is anyone missing fingers? Like, I know you just got to them, but like, the next question is going off of Anna, like, is anyone missing some fingers that are in other crypts?
That's a hard thing to answer because we're dealing with a couple factors. One, obviously, we don't have the burials for everybody that ever existed.
Right.
We have a very limited sample. And two, we're working in the tropical lowlands where the preservation can be fragmentary. So are they really missing fingers, or do we just not have them because of, you know, so we have to consider all of those other things. Yeah. Yeah.
So with the fingers, like, okay, you said there were no chop marks, which would be really obvious because sometimes people don't know the anatomy well and they'll cut like midway through, because that would be my next.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, Jenny already asked that one.
Yeah, I remember that. I was like, nope, you already did.
No, good question. No, whenever I mention the finger bowls, I know everybody's really interested in those. All right, any other questions? Okay, I'll come back with a report after this summer and we'll see those small, tiny little platforms on the other side of group 4, whether I finally found such a thing as a Palenque commoner. Right now, the going hypothesis, or has been theorized, that Palenque is just a city of rich folks and there are no commoners. So I need to find them to suggest whether that's the case or not. So I'll come back and report after this summer's field season. All right. So thank you all for signing in and for attending virtually, and the few of you that are here in person. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Happy midterms week.
I'm gonna clap.